Contradictions occur when a combination of statements or ideas or beliefs or characteristics oppose each other. The pictures on the right here provide some examples. Oftentimes in our conversations, we let slip with contradictions, such as these, referring to a small crowd. That's a contradiction, small crowd. Exact estimates, original copies, something pretty ugly, fully empty, or seriously funny. Those are all contradictions. Again, some of us may be guilty of telling people to act naturally. That's a contradiction. Or of their only choice. It's a contradiction. Of course, when comments are made about our comments or our advice, we may say that we have been clearly misunderstood. And that's a contradiction too. Christians can easily be caught up in contradictions in our very fast-paced societies. A little limerick says, "In a day of illusions and utter confusions, upon our delusions, we base our conclusions." Some of our conclusions show the results of contradiction. A lot of these can be found on websites that are actually hateful of Christians. But some can be noted here. Number one, for example, some Christians steal software, songs, and sermons, but would never steal a loaf of bread. That's a contradiction. Number two, some Christians seek a balanced life, but dedicate 75% of their time to their job, and another 15% of their time to electronic and digital media. That's a contradiction. Number three, some Christians complain of not growing in their Christian lives, but they choose no course for correction, and that's a contradiction. So we have followed contradictions from the silly to the simple, now to the saint. The passage for this message reveals Jesus confronting the contradictions of religious leaders in Jerusalem. Pause this presentation now and read or listen to John 7:14-31 at this time. In the previous message, we left Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles. So what happened there? In the passage for this message, we see that Jesus immediately got into a debate over what truth was and what truths were. In verse 15, we are told that the religious leaders were amazed at his knowledge. They knew he had not studied with them at their schools. He was a carpenter's son, meaning he had not qualified to enter their advanced schools, and he had simply learned a trade from Joseph as a carpenter. There was some kind of contradiction going on in their minds, you see. Going back to our definition of contradiction, there was a combination of statements made by Jesus, ideas that he was fostering, and beliefs that he was bringing up, and all these things were mixing up in their minds, and they were contradicting each other. Contradiction. So this led to the Lord's explanation of the seeming contradictions. In verse 16, he explained that number one, his teaching came straight from the one who sent him, and that teaching would not fit into their previous statements, ideas, and beliefs. It would be a contradiction of their religious notions. In verse 17, he explained that number two, his teaching could be known only by those who chose to do God's will. And that teaching would not fit into their previous religious expectations. And that was a contradiction that was very real for them. And then here in verse 18, he explained that number three, his teaching served only to honor the one who sent him. And that would not fit their expectations either. You see, his teaching caused contradictions in their thinking. The fourth thing Jesus said in verse 18 here was that his teaching was the truth. And in saying that, he hit at the real issue of contradiction. What is truth and what is untruth? Here we can be helped by reviewing the contrast that we made earlier between the truth of God's life and the truths of human life. That came from John chapter 1, verses 14 to 35. From the Lord's teaching on that day, we can add one more contrast. Truth is taught by God and differs from truths that are taught by people. Let's expand these contrasts that we have just looked at, because there are many more differences, and these conflicts are the heart of the Lord's interaction with these religious leaders. And they also speak to our tendencies to hold on to truths instead of the truth. So let's look first at God's truth. It is his God-centered declarations of what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. Truth is focused on God, and it has only one aim. Truth is subject to God's revelation. Truth leads to consistency and coherency. Truth never changes, and it is always relevant. Truth preserves us. It is powerful and solid. And finally, truth provides security and certainty. Now contrast God's truth with our truths. What are they, our truths? They are human-centered estimates of good and bad, right and wrong. They are filtered or sorted out by people, and as a result, they have multiple aims. Truths are subject to human worldviews, not to God's revelation. They lead to inconsistency and contradiction. They are constantly changed and made relevant. We have to preserve such truths, and so they are packaged and sold. And then finally, such truths that are human-centered prompt insecurity and uncertainty. We need God's truth and not the many truths of human-centered thinking. In this passage, we need to see Jesus as the man of truth, the man of God's truth. He's facing the religious leaders, the people of human-centered truths. The contrasts help us to see how serious the encounter was. And we need to see how we ourselves can be easily caught up in the circles of those religious leaders. One Christian writer has said, "The most unpleasant people I know are those who believe they exclusively know the truth and make the coercion of others their primary mission in life." We don't want to be like them. There are even extremes characterized by violence, domineering Christian leadership, and justification and rationalization for acts that otherwise would be unacceptable. The religious leaders whom Jesus encountered were in the latter situation. They were becoming tempted to violence. They were being led by loud leaders. And as will be seen in the verses that now follow, they were having to justify and rationalize their behavior. Why? Because they were people of truths and not people of the truth. Then Jesus began to reveal the contradictions of those who attacked him in verse 19. He said, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me?" He challenged the contradiction of what they taught and what they wanted to do. They wanted to kill him. And after all, Moses, whom they taught, did say, "Thou shalt not kill." At this, the crowd, meaning mostly the same religious leaders who were doing all the shouting, answered, "You are demon-possessed. Who is trying to kill you?" It's verses 20 and 21. The contradiction was out, and all they could do now was divert the argument away from their contradictions. Jesus would not let them escape their contradictions, however. Why did he refer to his miracle in this passage and their astonishment? Perhaps it was to show the crowds the contradiction of what? Their superficial interests and their hearts being bound by the law of Moses. It's a contradiction. But then he went on to show the religious leaders their contradiction. They followed Moses. Moses gave them circumcision, but also the Sabbath. The instructions on circumcision required some boys to be circumcised on a Sabbath, because it had to occur 8 days after the birth according to Mosaic law. Thus, the Jewish leaders were themselves breaking one law to preserve another one. That is a contradiction. And that's what Jesus pointed out to them. Then he compared their contradiction to his previous healing on the Sabbath, done 1.5 years before, and which they are still complaining about. You see, the contest was between truth without contradiction and truths with many contradictions. Then in verse 24, Jesus said, "Stop judging by mere appearances." By that he meant by what you expect to see, by human-centered standards, with all their contradictions. Instead, he said, "Judge correctly." And by that he meant by God-centered standards without contradictions. In verses 25 to 27, the crowd began to see the contradictions of their religious leaders. They were trying to kill Jesus, yet he was right there in front of them. That's a contradiction. Maybe they thought they had concluded that he was the Christ. Then they faced one of their own contradictions. It says that they knew where Christ came from, but they had been taught that no one was to know where the Christ was to come from. So they identified a contradiction in their own religious expectations. So Jesus confronted them again with their own contradictions in verses 28 and 29. He said, "Yes, you know me, and you know where I am from." Then he went on to more or less say, "But you really don't know me, because you really don't know the one who sent me and where he is from. Therefore, you can't really know where I am from." Do you see the contradiction? Which truth applied for them? Then he declared the unquestionable truth, "But I know him because I am from him and he has sent me." No contradiction. In verse 30, John himself wrote that the crowd tried to seize Jesus, but were not able to even get a hand on him. You see, that effort was another contradiction. It was a physical contradiction. They wanted to get him, but they couldn't. I don't think even John knew how to handle that event at that time. I think it probably was a contradiction of his own understanding of things, because it was only 60 years later that he wrote the Gospel of John and these words by inspiration. And when he said that the Lord's hour had not yet come, finally, here in verse 30. Finally, though, at the death and resurrection of Jesus, just 6 months later, John would get past his own unresolved questions. And for him, that was the hour in God's eternity. It was also the hour when John started getting the truth right. And that hour is also the time when our eyes could be opened, if we would look, to recognize life in life living that began with Jesus. Finally, in verse 31, it says, "Still, many in the crowd believed in him." They put their faith in him. So I ask, why? Was it because of what he said? No. If you go on and read this, it says, unfortunately, they believed because it was still because of what they saw. They saw miracles and signs. They heard nothing about what Jesus said. They said, "Look at his miracles." It was not because of his revelation. Their human-centered expectations and interpretations overpowered the need for revelation. Their so-called faith was simply part of their religious framework, and that framework was riddled with contradictions, and it was not the kind of faith or belief that Jesus sought. Reflecting back on this encounter that dealt with contradictions, we have seen that neither the crowds nor the religious leaders recognized their own inconsistencies and their contradictions. And that is often the case for all of us. And so that brings us to 3 questions that we can ask for final application. Number 1, what contradictions may exist in your daily life and in your Christian life? Number 2, in what way, if any, Are loyalty to human-centered truths a danger to your faith? And number 3, is your faith the kind of faith that Jesus wants? As this message concludes, I hope it has increased your desire to see what is next in this fascinating Gospel of John. When you're ready, please go on to consider Life in Life lessons in John chapter 7, verses 32 to 52. And may God bless you.